Here we go. So thanks so much for joining me in this conversation, Aaron. I think it's a really timely conversation as I know there's a lot of people right now that are kind of in that job searching space and maybe newer to Canada, and that's one of the groups of people that I really enjoy helping, and it's important to me that we give people timely and valuable information about what it's like to actually job search in Canada. And I know, from our experience working together in the past, kind of in the HR side of things and hiring people, um, I was proud myself as an HR manager of building diverse teams. And at one point when I was working for one particular company, um, our staff was only about maybe 300, but that included like 23 different nationalities, and about 15% of the workforce that I oversaw was on work permits and were international workers. And so I personally believe in the benefits of hiring diverse teams, and I know that you've had your own experience both in recruitment doing that, but also coming to Canada as an international, worker. And so I'd love for our audience just to hear a bit about when you came to Canada on a work permit, and what was your journey like coming in as a new Canadian navigating the job market here.
Yeah, thanks, Ariel. So yeah, my name's Aaron Cresswell. So I moved to Canada, so around about 10 years ago, it was now. And so I moved from Australia. And yeah, it was a very interesting experience. And I know that from the outset, there were definitely some challenges to, yes, get into the job market, so to speak. And as we go through some of the discussion here, I guess I'll highlight some of those areas where I had the experience for myself, getting into the recruitment field from where I was working in Australia as a recruiter, and then continued through Canada from British Columbia, and then a year after that, moving to Calgary and really settling there for the majority of my time in Canada. So uh, we can talk about some of those challenges and my experience navigating the job market, and some of the tips I think I might be able to share with helping others find work in Canada.
Yeah, awesome. So as a recruiter, you have to review like hundreds of thousands of resumes, right? We know that. When you're reviewing resumes, like what grabs your attention? And maybe especially if you see someone that, seems to like mostly have international experience, or maybe they only have international experience, you can tell that they're brand new. What's something that grabs your attention when you're looking at those kind of resumes?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you're right. Sometimes hundreds of resumes, even for one job posting. And I think it's really important to give that insight that uh, there is limited time to review resumes, especially if we have multiple job openings and each posting has hundreds of resumes. There's limited time to spend on each resume. So, what really catches my eye at the very beginning is more so the company they work for, and what I'm looking for is examples. Talk about the STAR method, the situation, the task, the action, the result. Uh, Breaking that down briefly. Uh, what happened? What did you do specifically? And what action did you take? And also, what was that result? Was it a financial saving? Did you come up with a new process to improve efficiency? I'm looking for the context of that at the very beginning of
Mhm.
your the description of your duties. And I think,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to international experience, I may not know what that company is, so it's important to relay that information.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. How do employers typically view international experience, on a resume? And is there ways that candidates can translate that more effectively, perhaps? Or do you see some doing that better than others? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I think international experience can be challenging, and ultimately it comes down to the hiring manager. And the various companies that I've worked at, uh, you know, whether or not there is a shift in mindset to uh, say that the international experience doesn't matter. We're just looking for a candidate with uh, X experience in X field. Um, the ultimate decision comes down to the hiring managers, and that can differ even within organizations. And so, uh, what I would say is to help relay or to help educate some hiring managers, if you have international experience, as I mentioned just previously with the companies, they may not know what those companies are. And so, one of the recommendations that I have, and something I've seen on resumes from candidates come from outside of Canada, is to have the company name on the resume and their job title, but just under that, on their resume, just a short description, one sentence of what that company is and what do they do. And that just gives them context to understand, okay, this is a company in telecommunications or energy or what have you. So this helps the hiring manager give a bit of more context as to where you're working, what is the size of the company, is it a small business or large, and that helps.
Yeah, that sounds so helpful, right? And I can understand that just that little bit of context could change how that whole experience section reads and how all the bullet points read because now you have context for what you were doing, and even if you describe the scope of the position slightly or the scope of the projects the company was involved in that, sentence or two, that can just give so much more context to those achievements that they're talking about. That makes a lot of sense. Um, what are some of the misconceptions that you see newcomers have about Canadian employers and maybe what they value or what they're looking for?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say, well, one of the things I've seen is the detail on resume. Uh, and it's a point worth touching on because again, there's a lot of subjective thoughts on how much detail should go into a resume, and I've seen that um, from international candidates, some resumes have been 7, 8, 10 pages, and the idea is to put as much information as you can. What was it? All of the duties that they've done in the past, right? And I think a lot. I go first of all, recruiters going through many resumes don't have a lot of time to go through that many pages. Having said that, if the experience is valid, sometimes it does go through and make it to hiring managers, and that's some of the feedback that I've seen is that they also don't have time. And I know from the HR teams they're busy, but then you look, one step further, and maybe the hiring managers are then doing a second review. I think that's one misconception I would say that I've seen. Um, and understanding that the focus should be on looking at the job description and the company that the candidate is applying to, and that qualification section. And that's really where your focus should be. When applying for a role and what Canadian employers value, it's the qualification section is really the hiring manager speaking out to say, or the HR, the recruiter, this is exactly what I'm looking for. How can you uh, customize, or how can you portray yourself in a way in a resume that fits, or at least helps you fit into what they're looking for in that qualification section?
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And do you have any specific tips in terms of how resumes should be formatted to really make sure those qualifications are showing through effectively on the resume? What is your preference as a recruiter when you're scanning, so many different styles of resumes? What do you like to see?
Yeah, typically there's a resume with a summary, education, and qualifications. When we're looking for maybe a a certain degree or education, I think that should be at the top. That just really helps a recruiter see, okay, we're looking for mechanical engineer. We have the mechanical engineering. That's one ticked off at the beginning rather than very at the bottom of the resume. When we look at some of the qualifications for the role itself, 5+ years experience in contracts or legal field or something that's specific. Uh, you'd really want to highlight that either in the summary at the top or at least in the bullet points from your most recent jobs. Really, what's going to get a lot more attention is the last 2 or 3 positions you've held at various companies. As you further go down, it's becomes not less relevant. However, a resume's job is to catch the eye of a recruiter or a hiring manager. Its ultimate job is really to get you a job. That's the purpose of the resume. It's almost like a sales pitch, and so um, that would be my feedback: is to look at those qualifications and try to build the experience that you have into the first few positions that you've worked at.
Yeah, 100%, and I often advise my clients, like, 10 to 15 years max on your resume, right? Like, it shouldn't read like an entire life story, especially for someone who has a significant amount of experience or employers, because really those last 5 years, at least if they are relevant to the roles you're pursuing now, are the most critical, and if they're not, then you need to find ways, to obviously adjust and highlight and maybe bring some of the older experience to the forefront, and that's something that I coach on when we're developing resumes, with my clients, but it's good to hear what you're looking for and how easy really, that the candidate should be making it for the recruiter to literally tick the boxes and find what they're looking for. Back to this kind of idea of like international experience and how it's perceived. How do you think candidates that have a significant or maybe only international experience can be an asset to Canadian employers. And why should Canadian employers, be looking for maybe people that have that level of more international than local experience?
Yeah, there's a lot of qualified candidates that are international. I mean, Canada itself is very international and diverse country. A lot of people move to Canada and have been for well, ever since I moved there like 10 years ago during that process. And so the experience that international candidates have, the benefit to employers is that they have experience that you wouldn't find elsewhere. And I can talk, like just for example, off the top of my head here, for energy industry, when I worked at a company that was doing a gas project up in northern BC, we were looking for candidates that had offshore experience, and so, and the maritime experience, and we don't have much of that in Canada. We have, BC, and we have over the eastern side, and that's it. And so there are some candidates that bring experience that just feasibly isn't possible in Canada or have looked at uh, working in a way that's new to Canada, or they're being, regardless of the industry. And so it's important to validate and qualify and quantify that experience. And employers, I believe employers would miss out if they didn't necessarily investigate that experience and understand it. And that sometimes warrants either a phone call or a face to face.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, that's such a good point, and I think that brings, something to mind for me, which is this idea of, like, transferable skills, right? Some of the industries or the areas or even the job titles might be slightly different than, where they came from. How can newcomers translate those transferable skills from, similar industries or from similar backgrounds when they're applying to Canadian roles? What should that look like when they're trying to highlight those transferable skills?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the qualifications and what is the employer looking for. So we look at that and understand, okay, you may not have done exactly what the employer is looking for, but how can that relate? And so, even mentioning, and I wouldn't necessarily go to the point of copy and pasting the job description or bullet points in that and putting in a suggestion as to how your experience has, I guess, take that box, so to speak. I have seen that in the past from my experience with some hiring managers. They favor that and some haven't. It's more so, you know, a more subtle way of building that in. And I would just relay the fact that you have that experience, albeit not necessarily exactly what the employer is looking for. Uh, I think it's just important for the hiring manager to understand this is a candidate that doesn't necessarily have the experience, however, the direct experience they're looking for. However, here's this other experience that we have that is relevant and can it can work with a little bit of training to get up to speed with whatever the employers require.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think, when I'm helping candidates to, target their resumes to positions and I see there's that similarity, sometimes what I look for is the language being used, right? Like, are they mimicking the technical terms and the language that the employer is using? Because sometimes it can be different language in different industries, but the tasks are very similar or the role is really similar. So mimicking language I find can be really helpful, just to create that resonance with the employer that's reading it. And then also even just sometimes saying like similar to, or as noted in, if it's in a cover letter, for example, as noted in your role, I've done this, which is similar to, and just really actually connecting the dots for the reader because I don't think we can assume that every recruiter, every hiring manager knows exactly what you mean sometimes when you say certain things on your resume. So I think, yeah, connecting those dots with the language and with the examples is really important. Would you agree? Anything
You raise,
else to add?
yeah, you raise a good point. For the cover letter, and understanding, you're right. This is what you're looking for. Here's the experience I have that matches that or can aid with that. And I've seen that on resumes and I've seen that work quite successfully. And so, when looking at just, necessarily the resume itself, and you're gonna on the fence, so to speak, it could go either way. And then understanding, oh, okay, right, now that helps me understand. So this experience here isn't exactly what we're looking for, close to it, but you've explained how that experience can help translate to what the employer is looking for based on maybe your research of that employer or the industry knowledge that you have in Canada. now you're translating effectively what you have, what you're looking for, and kind of connecting that bridge. So I agree.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. So I want to tackle maybe one of the more subtle challenges, with newcomers coming in. I think we talked a bit about the resume and the skills and how they translate, but it's this idea of kind of DEI, right, or DEIB, and how employers talk a lot about saying they want diverse talent. That they are all about equity and inclusion in their hiring practices and all of that. And I believe a lot of them are. But sometimes there's a gap between that intention or that language and the action, and I think it can come from a bit of a disconnect in terms of maybe how the candidates are applying or what the perception is. In your experience doing recruitment, what can contribute to that disconnect between that desire to hire diverse talent, but the actual, translation of those people getting jobs?
Yeah, and it's an important area to discuss. And I think, from my experience and working in various organizations, small and large, uh, what I've seen is the decisions, whether or not there's a corporate policy or a governance, a larger governance surrounding it from a human resources perspective, or even bigger, company wide. What I've seen is that the decision really ultimately comes down to the hiring manager. We have uh, in many organizations, there's a HR team and a recruiter, and the recruiter would be the first uh, scan of the resumes to shortlist. So the managers aren't going through necessarily hundreds of resumes, for example. So we have a kind of a stop point there, or a filter point there, and then subsequently to the hiring manager. And typically, from my experience, in other ways, sometimes there's some collaboration in terms of which candidates I push through, and there's some ways to navigate that. In other cases, it's ultimately or solely down to the hiring manager. And so, when we look at um, initiatives, I think they can help, but the disconnect, I would say, if there was a lack of hiring candidates that are diverse, then that would require coaching with an individual team or subgroup or business unit in an organization. Uh, and that's something that really th- not much action is taken unless it's taken from leadership or the HR team themselves to help coach those business units or areas, and do this. So it really does come down to uh, the wider HR team and the employees in those HR teams to actually make a difference, and and speak up about what can we do to uh, have a diverse workforce and champion that. It's a lot more challenging than, having, as you say, having a policy and employers want to, but it's more about that action and, almost, hiring leaders, hiring managers, and also HR teams um, that want to champion that.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I think, like, as from my experience in being in HR and your experience in recruitment, I think we're educated to some extent as professionals in our field about this kind of idea of unconscious bias and how to be aware of that and how to potentially avoid it. And it's not just for newcomers, there's ageism bias, there's other biases as well. But what have you noticed as a recruiter when, especially because you came from as an external Canadian, right? Like you joined the workforce. What have you noticed about that unconscious bias or maybe sometimes conscious bias, and how does it impact the candidate experience and kind of that equitable hiring practice?
Yeah, I've seen the unconscious bias, and that, as you say, as HR professionals, we're aware of what that is, and I think some hiring managers are also aware of that. But I think as HR professionals that it needs to be uh, identified, right? And I think from the many hundreds and hundreds of interviews that I've done in person, or via Zoom or virtually, um, you can almost identify that unconscious bias based on some of the feedback that's received after an interview, for example. And so it's about coming around to the table and understanding, here's a candidate. Here's what we're looking for. Here's the fit within the culture and the company. Let's talk about that as opposed to some of the other biases that some managers might have, or some of the feedback that's shared following post interview. For myself, uh, understanding that I was new to Canada, what were some of the challenges for me were understanding what is the fit, what is the fit in the culture in Canada. I mean, one of the first interviews that I had here, I had my full suit tie. I mean, I was just missing the waistcoat. and actually, I remember the comment of the hiring manager saying, "Well, I think you should be interviewing me." Um, it's not. Then I realized that maybe that's almost overdressed for candidates. So, uh, and so just understanding that and knowing what can we do to overcome those biases.
Yeah. Yeah, presentation is such an important part, right? Whether you're in person or online, I always, advise my clients dress, maybe slightly more formal than you think the work culture would be and the work environment would be, and you need to do a bit of research and take a look at the photos of the people, or go to the office if you have the opportunity, show up and find out how do they dress, and if consider the environment if you're going to an office downtown or if you're going to a medical clinic or you're going to a construction job site, there's going to be different standards, and so you need to kind of dress, for the work environment, but maybe just like a little bit nicer than you would on a day to day in the job, just so that you're showing that professionalism. That's usually what I suggest because yeah, you want to look like you understand the company culture, right?
Definitely.
Talking about that idea of, like, fit, right? You mentioned that word fit, like the fit mindset. I think sometimes that can be a bit of an excuse, if I will, or, like, to kind of not hire, because it's like, oh, that they're not the right fit or the best fit. But when we move from that mindset of, really, which kind of can mean, I wanna hire more like us as opposed to being more diverse, right? I think fit can mean that. If hiring teams are able to move away from that only fit mindset to one that's a little bit more diverse and inclusive, what do you think would be the benefits to employers?
Uh, yeah, great question. I understanding, and you're right. Fit, the word fit can be an excuse, and as you say, let's replicate what we have already and keep growing. That that it diminishes creativity. It also doesn't allow for different ideas to populate. And I think the benefit of uh, finding someone that isn't necessarily a clone or a replication of what's already present is a new way of looking at things, right? It's challenging, right? Challenging the status quo. It's challenging the way things have been done the entire way, and also a different cultural fit. And when
Mhm.
I look at when I use the word cultural fit, I'm looking at personality and a team that may be more task orientated, and now we have someone that's more see, see, personable or bubbly, let's say, and more conversational, and that can bring a different dynamic to the team. It can bring out different elements to maybe some other coworkers that might be maybe too shy or less confident. Could increase their confidence. I think all around having a variety and a diverse team, when we look at it from a team perspective, can bring out the best in everyone, and also new areas uh, that people didn't realize they had once they have a right mix.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love how you describe that. And I think it's important to identify that when we're saying cultural fit, we're not talking about seeming more Canadian, like wearing your plaid. We're talking about the culture of that team, and that shouldn't be about like nationality or ethnicity culture. That should be about the dynamic of the team. And I love how you described that what that diversity can bring out. So I think that's super important. Um, so we can also kind of, err on the side of diversity just being a tick box. Like, hey, we know this. You talked about this mandate earlier, right? We know it's a mandate from HR. Maybe Ariel said, we need to hire more diverse workforce, and Aaron's doing his best to hire a more diverse, workforce. But in some ways, it can't just be a tick box either, because we have to keep, hiring equitable. And so this is where I think things can get tricky a little bit. What do you think are the risks if organizations are just solely focused on, DEI optics and just really hiring for diversity as opposed to for maybe overall fit, if we're using that word correctly?
Uh, yeah, I would say, and I've been in a situation where mm, this has been a mandate, and when I worked for an employer, and I've seen I guess the result of that when it's forced in terms of, instead of educated and understood to see some of the benefits, and when we look at that, some of the risks involved really hiring managers not taking the time to either properly assess or understanding that their hand is turned, to hire an individual from a certain area or background, and they're concerned. from a hiring manager perspective, and I think this is an important um, note to make, is that they have a gap on their team and they need someone to fill that gap, but they want to make sure that the person that fills that gap makes it as easy as for them as possible, right?
Mm.
So that they're proficient and what have you. And so when there are these policies in place that are forced in terms of instead of a desire to want to hire individuals in this space, then that's where I think hiring managers almost take a step back and just have a sense of that it's being mandated, and they're not having a voice to be able to find the right person for with the technical proficiency that they're looking for, especially if it's a technical role where
Yeah.
they need certain specifications or experience in areas. So
Yeah. Yeah, well said. Yeah, I agree. I think it is an important line to walk, right? So back to kind of some of our maybe our audience, they might be like, okay, well, this is confusing. So am I supposed to stand out as being diverse and recommend my international experience? Am I supposed to try and fit in and minimize that? Like where, should I highlight this diversity or, my identity, or is it going to hurt me in the process? What are your recommendations for newcomers based on sort of the landscape that we see happening in hiring?
yeah, I think people should be proud of their background. I mean, they shouldn't be hiding, their experience they've had internationally, where they've come from. I think, past based on the interviews that I've had in the past and the individuals that I've met, I've heard some fascinating stories about some of the experience, the companies they've worked for, even some of the experience just in general in life in some other countries that they've lived in, and some of the challenges they've gone through, and how that's built character and strength. And I see that, and sharing even some of the personal stories that I found does resonate with hiring managers, and just help put things on a more personable level and help understand, where did this person come from? What have they achieved? They've gone through some of this adversity, and here they are showing up for an interview, well presented, and that's something to be proud of. And I think that should be displayed, prominently, with the caveat, or with the note to say that make sure that experience is it's translated to what employers are looking for in Canada, so that you can get past that stage to get to the interview stage.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. And any advice for candidates navigating that interview stage, and having to address their maybe quote unquote lack of Canadian experience in an interview? What advice would you give them?
Uh, the advice I'd give them is understand what is the difference. So, whatever role that you're applying to, excuse me, understand what is the difference between the experience that you have and and how it is in Canada, processes, procedures, legal terms, whatever it may be in the field that you're applying to, and have an answer ready. Understand that you've got this experience, and you could even mention that in the interview. Okay, especially if it's a question directed towards, do you have experience in X? Knowing that only in Canada you'd get that experience. If a question say, well, you can answer to say that no, I don't have that experience in Canada yet. I would like to, uh, although I do have experience in this area when I was in X country, and this is how it can translate. This is how I feel I can translate. It'll take me some time, a little bit of time to get up to speed. I would love to, learn that area. Although I'm fairly proficient, with no word for word, but effectively having that also prepared, that you can say you don't have the experience necessarily exactly, although here's my relevant experience that I know can help.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to address that, and I think that brings to mind for me the importance of upskilling at times or up credentialing at times if there are certain, knowledge standards, regulations, credentials that are required in your industry. Like, it's important to learn that before you're going through the job search or as you're going through the job search, and make sure that you address that with the employer, or even better, address it on your resume and in your cover letter so that you are not leaving them with a question mark of, "Do you have what we need to do this role?" Back to the beginning of our conversation about qualifications, right? Really being able to tick those boxes so that there's no question marks, and then addressing, yeah, as you said, how is your experience relevant? But I think sometimes people can get so focused on the experience and they maybe neglected some of those more technical aspects of the Canadian experience and what that actually means in that industry or for that employer. So understanding that and addressing that upfront, I think is super important. Yeah. Go ahead.
You mentioned there's a great point, Aaron. You just maybe think of another point that I think is quite valuable, and it's what I tell others and candidates searching the job market is courses and upskilling. Whether it could be as as big as a diploma, right? Or it could be even just LinkedIn courses. LinkedIn has some free courses or short courses online. Um, I recommend to candidates to add that to your resume. Even in the qualification sections, it may be a course that takes a week or 4 weeks, but if it's something specific to your role and it's Canadian um, and is what the employer is looking for, at least it shows the effort. And I think showing the effort, showing that you're not just throwing a resume out there and hoping someone, will kind of pull you out of the pool of the hundreds of people. It's showing that you're making that effort to say, look, I'm trying to understand here. I'm willing to learn. Here is what I've done to learn in the meantime before I even have a job.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I have one last question for you about qualifications that as we're talking about this, how important is it, do you think, for international workers to put their level of English skill, like their language skills, or reading and writing skills in terms of English on their resume, especially if they're from, not lesser English speaking companies or non-English speaking countries, sorry.
Uh, I've not paid attention to it in the past.
Okay.
I would say that not many candidates have put the level of English. Sometimes if they have multiple languages, then you'll see that intermediate, advanced, basic, what have you. And I haven't necessarily paid attention to that. And the reason being is that my preference would be to focus on, what are the skills and qualifications, how does that match what we're looking for or the organization's looking for? And then have a conversation with it, Ken.
Mm.
I can determine what that looks like. It's a phone call, it could be 10 minutes. And in some cases, that's not really something that is much of a concern. And I think that's important for people to hear and understand that. And I know, speaking a different language, especially, English as a second language is difficult and challenging. And there can be some uh, nerves or feeling embarrassed, what have you, and that's not to be the case. Because in my experience, it's more focused on the qualifications and the match um, than the language skills. It's rare that I've heard that an employer or hiring manager wouldn't want to move forward with an individual because of the language skill, and so um, I don't think that's as relevant for me and my personal experience.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably a relief for some of our audience to hear. That's great. Yeah. And for anyone who is concerned about their level of, English or language skill, in our third part in this series, we're going to be talking to a coach who actually focuses on language skill and confidence and accent in the workplace. So we'll have a more in depth conversation around how language impacts the international job seekers experience here in Canada. And our second guest is going to be talking about the immigration process and how that can change sort of the career path that you might be on and how to handle those challenges. So, but for today, this has been such an important conversation, Aaron, and I thank you so much for being here. And I want to leave our audience with something tangible to hold on to, kind of a key takeaway. So I'm curious if you could, wave a magic wand and have every newcomer have just one thing shift in their strategy for their job search in Canada. What would you suggest to them?
I would say don't take the any job that you're searching for, don't take the job description or the qualifications as set in stone. Some employers will ask for 5+ years experience. Some may even say 2+ years Canadian experience. I've worked at organizations where we've asked for 10+ years and we hired someone with 1 year experience, or an individual that only worked at a restaurant for 6 years and now they're working at such a large enterprise. And if they hadn't applied, they weren't a fit. Um, they wouldn't have been in the job they are in now. So if you see a position that you like or a company that you like, I would say just go ahead and apply. Don't take that for granted that you're not in the exact fit, because you definitely would have other qualities that hiring managers are looking for that aren't necessarily portrayed in just a job posting. So it's just go for it and be confident.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here today and for being our guest. I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom from your experience as a recruiter with our audience. And for anyone who wants to connect with Aaron or myself after this conversation on LinkedIn, feel free to find us on LinkedIn, and you can direct message us if you have any additional questions that we didn't talk about today because we're here to help. So thanks so much for your time, Aaron, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much for having me, Ariel. It's great.
Bye.
All right, take care. Bye.